I've made some very rudimentary little illustrations for you. Please forgive me for my for these illustrations. They're not great. My husband is actually a cartoonist. He's among other things, he like me wears a few different caps, but he's very good at cartoons. So later on, as I develop these videos, I will try to get him to do some cartoons for me. So I want to talk first of all about what is projection. Now, most of you know what projection is, probably, but I'll just reiterate it in a simple manner for anyone who maybe isn't really sure about it. So it's a theory of the mind originating from pretty much the father of psychology, and forgive me if there are a few others who came up with similar concepts that I'm not aware of, but Freud basically came up with the notion of projection. What I have here is a diagram of two brains of two people, and the person who's projecting onto the other person, we'll call them the victim, because when you've got negative projection, and by the way, we can project positively onto people. We often do that at the very beginning of our relationships when we're in the honeymoon phase, and we project hopes and dreams onto the person. We tend to ourselves really fantasize about who that person is without really knowing them. That can happen a lot, and particularly when we're very infatuated with a person. So we do have to be a bit careful with that, and that's another issue that we will talk about, is part of projection that contributes to this coercive control that can occur, and how people slide into being under someone's control, why that tends to happen, what renders them vulnerable to that. But if you think, imagine two brains, two people facing each other, and you've got one person who's imagining who this other person is, and they've got a little bit of information about them, but not very much, and then they combine that information, maybe even ignoring some parts of the information they know about the person, and they fill in the gaps with all of their experience and their imagination, okay? Now, a really classic example of that type of projection in dangerous relationships, particularly relationships in domestic violence, where you have, say, a man that has a sexist schema, like a way of thinking about women, which is dangerous. What we'll see in that man is a set of views and beliefs and ideas about women that effectively reduce the woman to an object. It might be, she could be just, well, she exists for him, basically. She's there to serve him. She's there basically as an extension of his will, of what he needs. Now, I want to go further into this in another video, because this is a really complex one. This type of a problem arises in people when they tend to rigidly and repeatedly objectify another person that they're in an intimate relationship with. A person with this issue will actually have usually not progressed early in childhood beyond maybe the emotional age of a 3-year-old. So often, if you talk to victims of domestic violence, they will actually agree with the idea that what is happening, although it's very distressing during a fight, an argument where they're being attacked by the perpetrator, what they will describe the person as being like is like a very, very oversized large toddler having a tantrum. That this person is lashing out and fighting with you in such an irrational way that really you might as well be talking to a 2 or 3-year-old child. And actually, that really is a reflection of where that person's development was arrested at. When we're talking about attachment, this person has never had maybe experienced what we would call a differentiation of self. They haven't really ever, due to environmental factors, due to neglect, abuse and various things, ever maybe progressed beyond that very egocentric toddler phase of development. So emotionally, they're still sort of there, acting the way, and for those of you who've got kids or who understand child development, you'll really relate to this. In fact, you'll probably already know this, that, when children are very young, basically it's understood that they see their caregivers as an extension of themselves. They don't really understand that the other person is a separate person with a separate mind. which leads me to explain that the basis of a healthy relationship is sovereignty of mind. It's for both individuals to have developed enough in their own psychology to be able to respect the fact that everyone has their own mind, their own point of reference, and what I like to call their own garden, their own mind garden, where they've cultivated their identity, their self-esteem, their sense of self and self-concept. And what happens in an abusive relationship is that the abuser, because their own mind garden hasn't flourished and has never really been allowed to develop due to a lack of validation, etc., in childhood and various issues, they're unable to understand that the other person has their own mind garden, or that that mind garden it belongs to the other person and it's not to be interfered with. And if we want to enter into that person's mind garden, we need to go in through the front gate, not jump over the back fence. I'll talk to you more about that idea later on, but that's to do with psychological boundaries. And that's another concept, again, that I'll discuss in another video. So basically, projection is about when we make up a story about the other person and we impose that on the other person. And another way to imagine this is imagine that the person who's projecting is literally a projector, a movie projector. The person is projecting an image of you onto a movie screen, and you're actually behind that screen as the victim. They can't see you. All they can see is a projection of what they think you are. Whereas under healthy circumstances, for people who have a differentiated, actualized sense of self, they're able to adjust and make changes to their assumptions about the other person in a healthy way that allows that person to be themselves. A perpetrator of abuse doesn't ever accept the victim for who they actually are authentically, because somehow that authenticity threatens the abuser. That threatens that person on lots of levels for many different reasons. It can be because they're extremely defensive, and there's, again, a lot of developmental gaps in that person. So we've talked about two brains, one acting like a movie projector onto the other person, and that other person basically is trapped behind the movie screen and unable to come out from behind that movie screen and get that other person to see them as they really are, right? So what I then want to talk about is that what happens to that victim stuck behind that movie screen? Well, that victim, if they don't realise what's going on fairly quickly and deal with the situation and make a choice either to stand up for themselves in an effective way, and we'll talk about what's really effective in responding to projection maybe another time. When we get very caught up internalising what a person is saying about us, we do tend to fight back in a way that actually diminishes our power a little bit because we're buying into what the person's saying. Really, what's crucial when we are working to try and help people avoid or rescue themselves from very dangerous violent relationships is that from the very beginning, we need to be trying to detect this pathological pattern of projection very early on. It can even be projection happening in a manner that seems really quite benign and harmless, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What happens to the victim and to their mind if they stay in that situation? I'm sure you can all answer that question yourselves, but I'm going to make it explicit here. The victim who's stuck behind this screen being projected onto by the perpetrator is going to have to work very hard to maintain their sense of self, their dignity, their self-belief. They're going to naturally be feeling very attacked, anxious, and there's going to be, well, if I stay with this person, I either have to fight back all the time, and to a point it's really quite redundant because I can never get through to this person, and I get absolutely exhausted constantly trying to stand up for myself and never being heard. And often the more I stand up for myself, the more the violence escalates, the abuse escalates. What the abuser is basically doing is demonizing victim. They're demonizing their victim, and they're brainwashing them into believing over time in a version of themselves that doesn't exist. It's not the real, authentic version of the person. It's this version they're projecting onto the screen, right? And the version the abuser is projecting onto the screen is a one-dimensional version of the person. It's not that person. It's not the real person. It's a one-dimensional version, an objectified version, a dehumanized version, a diminished version. We'll talk about what that looks like in a minute, but I suppose what's really important to understand is that that can occur quite subtly at the beginning of a relationship, but we can really quite swiftly start to detect it and act quickly to test out in a relationship whether the person we're with is actually really someone we would reasonably presume is going to turn out to be an abuser. Just by doing some simple things throughout that early getting to know one another phase. And that's to do with setting psychological boundaries and standing up for ourselves, and doing so when it's still safe to do so, before we've become too vulnerable in the relationship to start to try to do that. Because it's important to know that when women are in a domestic violence relationship, it becomes actually at a certain point extremely dangerous to try to stand up to the abuser. The more, I suppose, firm, assertive and calm a victim is, actually the more that can escalate the aggression in the abuser, because somehow it triggers the insecurity in them. And although I'm not ever criticising anyone who tries to be assertive or stand up for themselves when they're experiencing violence in a relationship, we do need to understand the very specific dynamics of that relationship and how it's really very different due to projection from a much more healthy relationship where there's some volatility and arguing and projecting, but you've got two adults with a reasonable degree of integrity who are able to course correct and who are able to be self-aware enough to adjust their own behaviour and try to avoid mistreating the other person. So what I want to go on to explain is that projection in an abusive relationship is pathologically repetitive, okay? It continues on and on and on. In a healthy relationship, of course projection will occur. At the very beginning, we're both projecting. Most of the time when we're in love with someone, when we're really physically attracted and infatuated and the hormones racing around, where we know that it's a kind of a drug. It's all been studied. We know that we're on this high. We're seeing the best of the other person. We're cherry picking what we want to see of the other person most of the time, and we're often idealizing that person. And then we know that if we know about relationship psychology and what tends to happen in progression, we tend to come out of that honeymoon phase and become a bit disillusioned and start to notice the things about our partner that we don't really like, or that, or that's annoying. And we come out of that phase. And if we understand, we have knowledge, we have good relationship skills, we have healthy attachment, that's another issue that I'd like to talk about a lot. We're able to come to terms with that disillusionment and still love the person, but do so in a mature, active way. We're going to love the person actively. Whereas a person who is abusive doesn't have those skills, has an inability to really get to know the person they're in a relationship with. They don't really want to know the other person, perhaps because knowing that person authentically in a manner which means they accept that person for who they are and love them for who they are, that means that they can't control the person in the way that they feel they need to. They need to maintain a type of control, a hold, a power, a spell over the other person in order for them to feel okay inside. And when that spell is broken, when the victim eventually steps out from behind the screen, says, hang on a minute, that's not who I am. And if they do so quite late in the relationship, for example, by leaving, that's when, in very extreme domestic violence, in really dangerous relationships, toxic relationships, you can find that the perpetrator becomes homicidal, because that person actually needs to kill off this individual who's just appeared, you know, who is demanding to be treated like not a one-dimensional, you know, projection. Because the perpetrator is feeling so out of control of the situation, they must absolutely win, and that can mean killing that person. That's baffling for most of us. Most of us can't understand how anyone could behave like that, could want to do that.